The hedge had the thorns, and the Duke did not care. He stood behind it in the dark, his coat sleeves snagged on a branch. He refused to move, because moving meant sound, and sound meant she would know he was there. Below him, past the boxwood and the gravel path silvered with moonlight, Lady Cordelia Ashworth sat on a stone bench beside her aunt, and she was saying his name like it left a bad taste in her mouth. "I will not marry him for a title, Aunt Beatrice. I don't care what grandmother says. I don't care what it costs us. I would rather die a spinster in that draughty house than stand at an altar performing gratitude for a man who only wants a wife because the papers say a duke ought to have one." The Duke did not breathe. He had come to that garden expecting to overhear exactly the opposite. He had come expecting confirmation of what his mother, his solicitor, and half of London had been whispering into his ear for a month, that Lady Cordelia Ashworth, penniless ward of the formidable Dowager Countess of Renwick, was angling for him the way a starving woman angles for bread, that she smiled at him too carefully, that she appeared with suspicious regularity in whatever room he happened to occupy, that she was, in the words of his own mother, chasing you, Julian, the way they all chase you, only quieter, which is worse. He had believed it. God help him, he had believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative, which was trusting anyone at all. And now here he was, hidden like a boy playing at soldiers, listening to the woman he'd spent a month suspecting of scheming after his fortune tell her own aunt that she would rather starve than take it. "He proposed again this afternoon," her aunt said, and her voice had the practiced softness of a woman used to managing other people's feelings. Very prettily, too. Most girls would have wept with relief. "Most girls are not me," Cordelia said. "He didn't propose to me. He proposed to the idea of me. A quiet girl, easily grateful, unlikely to embarrass him at dinner. He could have sent his steward to do it and saved himself the trouble of pretending to mean it. That isn't fair to him, isn't it?" A short, humorless laugh. "He's asked me 4 times in 3 weeks, Aunt, and not once has he asked me a single question about myself. Not my favorite book, not why I stopped painting, not even my Christian name properly. The way you'd ask a person you intended to spend a life with. He asks as though he's settling an account. I won't be an entry in his ledger. I would rather be poor and unmarried and entirely myself than be purchased into being a duchess." The word purchased hit him like a slap, mostly because it was true. He had proposed to her 4 times, and he had done it the way he did everything since his brother died, and the title fell onto his shoulders like a wet coat, efficiently, correctly, with the minimum expenditure of feeling required to get the job done. He had decided, somewhere in the fog of grief and obligation that had been his whole life for 3 years, that Lady Cordelia Ashworth would suit quiet, well-bred, despite her circumstances, unlikely to cause scandal. He had not asked himself whether he liked her, because liking had stopped being a category he used for anything. He had not, he realized now, ever actually looked at her. "Your grandmother will be furious," her aunt was saying. "She has already told the Renwick set that the match is settled in all but name. If you refuse him a 5th time, then she will be furious," Cordelia said, and there was steel under the words. Now, the kind of steel that comes from a person who has decided finally that furious is survivable. "I have spent 6 years in that house, being furious at Aunt Beatrice. I have been told I am plain. I have been told I am fortunate to be fed. I have been reminded every single day that I am a poor relation, living on charity that could be withdrawn at any hour grandmother chooses. I know exactly what it costs to displease her. I have been paying that cost since I was 17. I would rather keep paying it than marry a man who looks at me the way one looks at a horse whose teeth are sound." The Duke, who was, in fact, the Duke of Ashcombe, though, in that moment, he felt considerably less like a duke, and considerably more like a fool with a thorn working its way through his sleeve into his wrist, stood very still and let that land. A horse whose teeth are sound. He had thought walking into this garden a quarter of an hour ago that he was going to overhear evidence of her ambition. Instead, he had overheard evidence of his own failure, delivered by a woman who did not know he was listening, which was somehow worse than if she had said it to his face. A person lying to your face can be argued with. A person telling the truth to someone else, believing herself unheard, cannot be argued with at all. It simply has to be swallowed. He swallowed it. Her aunt sighed, the particular sigh of a woman who has fought this argument before and lost it every time. You do know he's considered the most eligible man in England. I know he's considered the saddest, Cordelia said quietly now, and something in her voice changed, softened at the edges in a way that made the Duke's chest tighten unexpectedly. I've watched him at 3 balls and 2 dinners, Aunt Tess. He doesn't dance if he can avoid it. He barely eats. He answers every question in as few words as possible, as though speaking costs him something he can't spare. I don't think he wants a wife at all. I think he wants an obligation crossed off a list, so that no one can say the Duke of Ashcombe failed in his duty the way his father failed in his. And I understand that. I do. I understand wanting to prove yourself to people who are no longer alive to see it. But I will not be the proof. I won't spend my whole life as evidence in a case he's making to a dead man. The Duke's hand braced against the hedge, went very still. Because that was it. That was exactly it, said aloud by a stranger in a garden at night, more precisely than he had ever managed to say it to himself in 3 years of trying. His father had died believing Julian would never amount to the title, had said as much more than once, in the particular acid way the old Duke had of delivering judgment as though it were simply weather. His brother, older, golden, adored, had been meant to inherit, and had died of a fever at 26. And Julian had inherited instead, and every decision he had made since had been an argument with 2 dead men who could no longer hear him. Marry sensibly, manage the estate flawlessly, choose a wife who will embarrass no one, prove them wrong. Prove them wrong. Prove them wrong. He had never once asked himself what he wanted. He had simply run the calculation of what would silence the voices, and Cordelia Ashworth, quiet, correct, unlikely to cause a scene, had been the answer to an equation, not a woman he had troubled to know. He'll ask again, her aunt said. He's not a man who gives up easily. Everyone says so. Then I'll refuse again, Cordelia said. As many times as I have to. I would rather be talked about as the fool who refused a duke than remembered as the woman who married one and never once heard him laugh. There was a silence, after that a long one. Somewhere behind him, in the house, a clock struck the half-hour, and the sound carried thin and clean across the lawn. You could do worse than a man who's simply sad, Cordelia, her aunt said finally, gently. Sadness can be tended. Cruelty cannot. I know, Cordelia said, and her voice had gone soft again, almost young. I know that. I'm not made of stone, Aunt. There have been moments, small ones, where I've thought, if he would only say something true, just once, something that wasn't correct, or careful, or measured, for effect, if he would only forget himself for one sentence, I think I could love him quite easily. I think that's the worst of it. I think it would be very easy to love him if he ever let anyone try. The Duke closed his eyes. Behind the hedge, in the dark, thorns forgotten, the Duke of Ashcombe experienced something he had not experienced in 3 years, which was the sensation of wanting something badly enough that wanting it hurt. He waited until the 2 women rose from the bench, until their skirts had rustled away up the garden path, and the side door of the house had closed behind them with its familiar, complaining creak, and only then did he step out from behind the hedge, extract the thorn from his sleeve with more force than necessary, and stand alone on the lawn under a sky gone thick with stars. Thinking, he thought about his brother, who had laughed easily and often, and whom their father had loved without effort, the way one loves the sun for rising. He thought about his father, who had looked at Julian across 100 dinner tables, with an expression of patient disappointment, as though waiting for a wrongness to correct itself. He thought about the 3 years since, in which he had built himself, brick by careful brick, into a man who could not be criticized because he had removed everything from himself that might be criticized. No laughter to be called inappropriate, no warmth to be called weak, no opinions to be called foolish. Just correctness, endlessly, exhaustingly correct. And he had thought, God help him. He had actually thought. That correctness was the same thing as strength. A woman he barely knew had just told her aunt, believing no one listened, that she would rather be poor forever than marry that. He walked back into the house, through the terrace doors, past guests he did not see, past his mother's raised eyebrow from across the drawing room, and he did not stop until he found Cordelia's uncle, Lord Renwick's steward, at the edge of the card-room, and asked him, in a voice that came out rougher than he intended, where Lady Cordelia might be found at this hour, and whether she was by chance alone. She was in the small library. She was, in fact, entirely alone, curled into a window seat with a book she was not reading, her finger resting on a page she had clearly stopped seeing several minutes before he entered. She looked up when the door opened, and her face did the thing it always did around him. Smoothed itself into pleasant neutrality, the careful blank mask of a woman who has learned that showing anything at all is expensive. "Your Grace," she said, rising, smoothing her skirts. "I didn't realize anyone." "Please don't get up," he said, and then, hearing how abrupt that sounded, added more quietly, "Please, sit. I would like to sit as well, if you'll permit it, though I confess I have no idea what I intend to say, which is unusual for me, and I thought you should be warned." She blinked. Something flickered behind her eyes. Surprise, he thought, or the beginning of it. "You always know what you intend to say," she said carefully. "You're the most measured man I've ever met." "Yes," he said, "I've worked very hard at that. It turns out to have been a mistake." He sat down across from her in the low chair by the cold fireplace, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, really looked, the way he had not once managed to do, across 3 balls and 2 dinners and 4 proposals, and he properly saw, for the first time, that her eyes were a particular gray-green that changed with the candlelight, and that she had a habit of pressing her lips together before she said something she considered dangerous, and that she was watching him now with the wary, contained expression of a person bracing for the next disappointment life intended to hand her. "I asked you to marry me 4 times, he said. "Yes," she said very evenly. "You did. I never once asked you a single question about yourself in any of those 4 instances. I know, because I have just had it pointed out to me, rather forcefully, by someone who did not know I was listening, and who was entirely correct, and it has taken me the length of a walk across a garden to understand how correct." Color came into her face. "Your Grace." "Julian," he said, "if you're going to refuse me a 5th time, which I fully expect, and which I think, having heard your reasons, I entirely deserve, I would at least like you to refuse me by my name rather than my title. It seems the least I can arrange." She stared at him. The book slid, forgotten, from her lap onto the cushion beside her. "You were listening," she said slowly. "In the garden. I was hiding behind a hedge like a criminal," he said. "I came, intending to confirm a suspicion my mother has been feeding me for a month, that you are chasing me for the title the way half the unmarried women in London are chasing me for the title, and I discovered instead that you would rather die unmarried than take it. That you think, correctly, that I have proposed to an idea of a wife rather than to you, and that I have never asked your favorite book or why you stopped painting or your Christian name properly, and I would like to correct all 3 of those omissions right now, if you'll allow it, before I say anything else, Trav, because I think you're owed the answers to questions before you're owed another proposal from a man who hasn't earned the right to make one." For a long moment she said nothing at all. He watched her throat move as she swallowed. "You heard all of that?" she said again, faintly, as though trying to locate the exact edge of her own mortification. "Every word," he said, "including the part about the horse with sound teeth, which I intend to think about for the rest of my life, incidentally, because it was devastatingly accurate, and I have no defense against it whatsoever." Something crossed her face that might, in slightly better light, have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly suppressed. "I didn't mean for you to hear that," she said. "I know. That's precisely why it mattered. If you'd meant me to hear it, I could have dismissed it as a performance, the way I've dismissed most things said to me since my brother died, because most things said to me since my brother died have been performances of one kind or another. Grief performed at me, ambition performed at me, concern performed at me by people who wanted something from the estate. You weren't performing. You were simply telling your aunt the truth, and the truth was that I'm a sad man who proposes to women the way he settles accounts, and you would rather be poor than be an entry in my ledger." He paused. I wrote that phrase down, actually in my head. I intend to remember it for a long time. It was very good. I didn't intend it as a compliment, I'm aware. I took it as one anyway, in the sense that accurate cruelty is more useful than kind lies, and I have had a great many kind lies over the last 3 years and precious little accuracy. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he simply said what was true instead of what was correct. My favorite book is a rather embarrassing volume of naval history that my brother used to read aloud badly, doing all the voices, and I have never told anyone that because it makes me feel like I might cry, which is not a sensation I permit myself in public, or in private, or really at all. There, that's an answer to a question you didn't ask me, but I thought you should have one anyway, as a gesture of good faith. Cordelia's careful, contained expression cracked, just slightly, at the corners. "Why did you stop painting?" he asked, before she could recover the crack and seal it shut again. "You did paint, once. Once. My mother mentioned it, in passing, as evidence against you. Actually, she said you'd given it up the moment you understood it, wouldn't secure you a husband, as though that proved something venal about your character. I don't think that's why you stopped. I think someone told you it was a waste of time, and you believed them, because you'd been told so many things were a waste of time that you no longer had the energy to argue about one more." Her jaw tightened. For a moment he thought he'd overstepped, gone too far into territory that wasn't his to walk into. Then she spoke, and her voice had lost its careful neutrality entirely. "My grandmother said watercolors were an indulgence unbecoming a woman. In my position," she said, "my position being a poor relation, who ought to be grateful for bread and a roof, and shouldn't waste candles on frivolous pursuits. I painted anyway, for a while, by daylight, so as not to waste the candles. Then she found the paintings and told me they were amateurish, and that continuing to make them would only embarrass me further when people saw how little talent I actually had. So I stopped. Not because I believed her. Exactly. Because I was tired of paying for things I loved. What did you paint? Flowers mostly. And birds. Small, unremarkable things nobody else troubled to look at closely." She said it like an apology. The way people apologize for hobbies they've been taught to consider embarrassing. "I would like to see them," the Duke said. "Not out of pity, and not as evidence for some case I'm building against my dead father, which I understand is a habit of mine that you correctly diagnosed in that garden, and which I intend to work on. I would like to see them because you made them, and because you clearly still think about them. Given how quickly you defended the birds just now, and because I suspect they are considerably better than amateurish, given that your grandmother's opinion on most subjects has proven, in my limited experience, to be almost perfectly inverted from the truth." Cordelia laughed, a short, surprised, entirely unguarded sound, and the Duke felt something in his chest unclench that had been clenched for 3 years. "You've met my grandmother twice," she said. "Twice was sufficient," he said dryly. "I am reliably informed I do not make jokes, Lady Cordelia, but I would like the record to show that observation was very close to one." "It was," she said. "Congratulations." "Thank you. I've been practicing in secret." He allowed himself, for the first time all evening, something that might have been a real smile, small and slightly crooked, and entirely unrehearsed. "Your Christian name is Cordelia. I know that. I've known that since we were introduced. What I never asked was whether you preferred it, or whether you had some other name people who knew you well used instead." She looked at him for a long moment, something working behind her eyes. "Cora," she said finally, quietly. "My mother called me Cora. She died when I was 12, and no one has called me that since, because my grandmother considered it common." "Cora," the Duke repeated, testing the shape of it. "I would like to earn the right to use that name eventually. Not tonight. I'm aware I haven't earned much of anything tonight, beyond the humiliating distinction of learning my own faults secondhand through a hedge." Cordelia. Cora studied him with an expression he could not entirely read, somewhere between disbelief and cautious, dangerous hope. "Why are you telling me all this?" she said slowly, "instead of simply proposing again? You said you expected to be refused a fifth time. You could have gotten that over with quickly and saved us both the evening. Because I don't want to be refused a fifth time, the Duke said simply. And I understood standing behind that hedge, that if I proposed again the way I'd proposed the first 4 times, correctly, efficiently, like a man closing an account, I would deserve exactly the answer I got the first 4 times, and I would deserve it a fifth time too, and probably a sixth. For as long as I kept treating you like an item to be acquired, rather than a person to be known. Quote, so I decided, walking back across that lawn, that before I ask you anything else, I would like you to have some actual evidence of who I am, since apparently I have been remarkably stingy in providing any for the last month. You are owed evidence, not another performance of a proposal. Evidence. The clock on the mantel ticked through a long silence. Somewhere down the hall, faintly, the party went on without them. The scrape of a bow across a violin string, a burst of laughter, glasses meeting glasses. In this small library, with its cold fireplace and its single lamp, none of it seemed to matter at all. Tell me about the naval history book, Cora said finally, softly. The one your brother read badly, and he did. He told her about his brother James, 3 years older. Golden in every sense their father had valued, who had done all the ridiculous voices when he read aloud, terrible Scottish accents for admirals who were plainly from Kent, and who had died of a fever that took 11 days to run its course. What? 11 days during which Julian had sat by his bed and understood, with growing horror, that he was about to become someone he had never wanted to be. He told her about his father's last words to him, which had not been words of comfort or forgiveness, but a single instruction. Do not disgrace what your brother would have done well, delivered like a debt collector's final notice. He told her about the 3 years since, in which he had built a version of himself entirely out of correctness, because correctness could not be criticized, and how exhausting that had turned out to be, and how he had not understood how exhausting until a stranger in a garden had accidentally told him the truth about himself, and it had nearly knocked him off his feet. He had never told anyone any of it. Not his mother, who had her own grief to carry and precious little room for his. Not his solicitor, who dealt in figures and deeds and had no vocabulary for feelings at all. Not a single one of the women he had considered, in his cold accounting way, as suitable candidates for Duchess. Cora listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving his face, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. That's the most you've ever said to me at once, she said finally. In a month of proposals, that's more words than all 4 of them combined. I'm aware, he said. It's remarkably freeing, actually, once you begin. I recommend it, though I understand I'm hardly qualified to be recommending emotional honesty to anyone, given my 3-year track record of avoiding it entirely. She almost smiled. Almost. My grandmother will never permit this, she said, and her voice had gone careful again, the wariness creeping back in. Whatever this is, she has spent 6 years training me to be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness come my way, and to expect nothing more, and she will not simply stand aside and let me have this. Whatever you're offering, she profits from my dependence, Your Grace. She has told my aunt as much, more than once, thinking I couldn't hear. A poor relation who marries well is a poor relation who stops needing charity, and my grandmother has built half her social currency on being seen to provide that charity. She needs me small. She needs me grateful. She will not tolerate me becoming a duchess, who no longer requires her permission for anything. Then she'll have to tolerate being disappointed, the Duke said. And something had entered his voice now, something quiet and immovable that had not been there before. I don't intend to ask her permission. I intend to ask yours. Cora looked at him for a long, searching moment, as though trying to determine whether the man in front of her was the same one who had proposed to her 4 times, like a man settling an account, or whether something in the last half-hour had actually, genuinely changed. Ask me what? Exactly, she said. Because if this is proposal number 5, delivered with better manners than the previous 4, I should tell you now that better manners alone won't be sufficient. I told my aunt the truth in that garden. I would rather be poor and unmarried than be purchased into a marriage. However politely the purchase is conducted, I'm not proposing, the Duke said. She blinked, thrown. Not yet, he clarified. Not tonight. I think you're right that I don't deserve to. Not yet. Not after 4 attempts, built on nothing but correctness and convenience. I think if I propose to you tonight, having only known you properly for the length of one conversation in a library, I'll simply be repeating the same mistake with better dialogue. So I'm not proposing tonight. Then what are you doing? Asking if I might call on you properly, he said. As myself, this version. The one who just told you about his brother's terrible Scottish accents, not the version who proposes like he's finalizing a purchase order. Asking if I might see the paintings you stopped making and hear you defend the birds again, because you did it rather beautifully a moment ago and I would like to hear it properly. At length, with all the detail your grandmother never let you give. Asking if you would allow me the chance to actually earn a yes, instead of simply asking again and again until exhaustion produces one. He paused. And asking separately whether there's anything I can do about your grandmother. In the meantime, because I have considerable resources, Lady Cordelia, and very little patience left for watching a woman starve someone's spirit for the crime of having none of her own money. Cora's eyes had gone bright, and she blinked hard, twice, in the particular way of someone determined not to cry in front of a duke in a library at a party she hadn't wanted to attend. You listened to one conversation through a hedge, she said, and now you want to rearrange my entire life. I want to stop being party to the arrangement that's currently ruining it, he said. There's a difference, though I understand it may not look like much of one from where you're sitting. She was quiet for a long time. After that, the candle on the side table had burned down considerably, and somewhere in the house a clock struck 11, the chimes carrying thin through the closed door. You should know, she said finally, that I have refused you 4 times, not because I dislike you, Your Grace. I want to be honest, since you've been honest with me tonight, more honest than I expected, certainly more honest than I've had any right to expect from anyone in 6 years. I've refused you because I was terrified of exactly what almost happened just now, that I would say yes to a correct, careful man, and spend the rest of my life waiting for him to become a real one, and grow old still waiting. And now, she said slowly, I think perhaps you became a real one about 40 minutes ago, standing behind a hedge, which is either the least romantic origin story I've ever heard, or, possibly, the most honest one, and I haven't decided which. I vote for honest, the Duke said, though I acknowledge the hedge does the story no favors when repeated at dinner parties. Preen, pray. She laughed again, properly this time, a full unguarded sound that transformed her whole face, and the Duke thought, watching her, that he understood now exactly what she'd meant in the garden, about how easy it would be to love a man who forgot himself for 1 sentence. He had forgotten himself for considerably more than 1 sentence tonight, and it turned out to be the best decision he had made in 3 years. You may call on me, she said properly, as yourself, not as a man settling accounts. I make no promises beyond that. I want none, the Duke said. Promises extracted before they're earned are just correctness, wearing a different coat. I've had enough of correctness to last several lifetimes. He rose, and she rose with him, and for a moment they simply stood there in the low lamplight, close enough that he could see the exact gray-green of her eyes had darkened slightly, close enough that he became abruptly, painfully aware of how badly he wanted to close the remaining distance and did not, because she had not given him leave to. And, because for the first time in 3 years, he understood that wanting something badly was not the same as being entitled to take it. Midnight, he said instead, glancing at the mantel clock. I have perhaps 40 minutes before your grandmother notices your absence and mine and begins constructing whatever narrative suits her purposes best. She'll say we were compromising ourselves in a library, Cora said with weary accuracy. She said worse about less. Then let her say it, the Duke said. I find I no longer particularly care what your grandmother says about anything, which is itself a rather significant development for a man who has spent 3 years caring intensely what everyone says about everything. He walked her to the door, and at the threshold, with the noise of the party swelling faintly beyond it, he stopped. Cora, he said, testing the name again, watching her face for permission he had not yet earned to use it freely. She did not correct him. "Thank you for telling your aunt the truth tonight. I know you didn't intend it for me. I think it may be the most valuable thing anyone has said to me since my brother died." "Thank you for listening properly," she said, "instead of just hearing what confirmed what you already believed. That's rarer than you'd think, Your Grace." "Julian," he said. She considered him a long moment, weighing the name in her mouth before she used it. "Julian," she said, and it sounded in her voice like the beginning of something entirely new. They returned to the party separately, at a discreet interval, the way propriety demanded. And if anyone noticed that the Duke of Ashcombe spent the remainder of the evening watching Lady Cordelia Ashworth across the room with an expression considerably less correct and considerably more human than anyone had seen on his face in 3 years. No one remarked on it aloud, though the Dowager Countess of Renwick certainly noticed, and certainly filed it away, and certainly began, before the night was through, calculating how such a development might be turned to her advantage or crushed before it became one. But that was a battle for another day. That night, as midnight came and went and the last carriages rattled away down the drive, the Duke of Ashcombe walked home under a sky gone thick and bright with stars, and he thought, not for the first time that evening, but for the first time without dread attached to the thought, about what it might mean to build a life out of truth. Instead of correctness, he thought about naval histories read aloud badly. He thought about watercolor birds nobody had troubled to look at closely. He thought about a woman who would rather be poor and unmarried than purchased, and who had, despite everything, agreed to let him try to earn something better than a purchase. He did not propose again that night, though the video title promised he would, and in a manner of speaking, he did. Not on one knee in a garden with a ring in his palm, but in a library, in the truest form a proposal can take, which is simply this: "I see you now. I am sorry it took me so long. I would like to keep seeing you if you'll allow it, for as long as you'll have me." It would be several months yet before the ring, before the vows, before the Dowager Countess of Renwick discovered exactly how far her cruelty had traveled beyond her control, and exactly how little power she had left to stop what she'd set in motion the day she taught a frightened girl that love was something to be earned through gratitude rather than given freely. That story, her downfall, and Cora's full vindication and the wedding that followed it, belongs to another telling. But it began there in a library at midnight, with a duke who had finally stopped performing correctness long enough to become, for the first time in 3 years, entirely and unguardedly himself. And a woman who had spent 6 years being told she was worth very little, discovering, in the space of one conversation, that she had been wrong about that all along. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. If you were sitting in that library with him, I would love to know, what did you feel when Cora said she'd rather be poor than be purchased? Tell me in the comments, and let me know which city you're watching from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. If this one moved you, please consider subscribing, so you don't miss the next one. There are many more dukes, many more secrets, and many more women finding out exactly what they're worth. Until then, from all of us here, good night and sweet dreams.